So Improvisation 19. He's using titles like composition and improvisation a lot during these years. He also sometimes uses the term impressions. Impression is the most spontaneous, direct reaction. He calls it a direct impression of outward nature expressed in purely artistic form. An improvisation, such as this one, is a largely unconscious, spontaneous expression of inner character, the non-material nature. It's a more direct, expressionistic kind of art. And then compositions, we're talking about composition 4 just before the break. Composition is an expression of a slowly formed inner feeling which comes to utterance only after long maturing. In this, reason, consciousness, purpose play an overwhelming part, but of the calculation nothing appears, only the feeling. So compositions are not just impulsive and directly expressive, they're more considered or more distilled, but what you're distilling is nevertheless emotion. You know, your thinking has played a part in it, but it's still guided by feeling, I think he'd want to say. These kind of terms, well, especially the term composition, it could be almost like a musical term. And the analogy with music is very important during these times. I'll have more to say about that. Well, it's probably even more abstract, this one, Composition 19, than what we've already seen. But maybe we can read these as a group of figures. Again, the outline is very strong, but the colour doesn't worry about that. And once more, the colour is quite thinly applied so that different layers can join together and it can activate the surface. It isn't that he couldn't be bothered to do it more neatly or something like that, you know. Solidity is undermined by the way the colour pays no attention to form. So that creates a kind of unifying effect as well. Small Pleasures, 1913. Well, we have the castle on the hill, that motif that we've seen before in his art. It's a very topsy-turvy world here, though. There are figures still, but it's becoming hard to make things out. Maybe we still have riders on horseback. Maybe we can make out 3 riders. It's a little bit like the biblical theme of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You know, that's maybe where he's taking the subject of riders from. The last book of the Christian Bible, the Revelations, which tells a sort of story in veiled symbolic language of the end of the world, what will happen in the last of days. 4 horsemen will come, and the last of the 4 is death. So it's a vision of an ending of a world. And I think Kandinsky and many other people of that time felt that they were living in a kind of time where an age was coming to an end. Maybe an age of materialism, you know, modernity and its discontents, an age of materialism they're living in, but that age of materialism will end and some new, more spiritual era will come. For example, there was a sort of spiritual writer, Rudolf Steiner, who was active at that time, and Kandinsky was interested in his writings and went to his lecture, you know, in Munich at that time. He talked in that way about, the dawning of a new spiritual era. Maybe the dawn would be, there'd be a sort of slightly turbulent beginning. You'd have to go through some kind of difficult phase before you get to that new era. Rudolf Steiner was interested he writes about the book of Revelations in the Bible, which has always been difficult to interpret. It's not a sort of a literal narrative story. And Rudolf Steiner emphasizes the importance of art. He's very influential on art, as he himself was something of an artist. He talks about the importance of art being a little bit cryptic, a little bit difficult for people to decipher. Like the book of Revelations in the Bible itself is difficult to decipher. His view is that that's to do with preventing misunderstanding, preventing too materialistic a way of understanding things. So instead of telling people the difficult story, you will just give them little keys, and if they're spiritually evolved enough, they'll be able to read those keys, decipher those symbols, use those keys. So maybe Kandinsky is trying to do something similar, to talk about spiritual concerns, but in a veiled language. Sometimes the subjects of these works are clearly decipherable as being to do with the world of Revelations, the idea of the end of the Last Judgment, the end of the world. He's not using a straightforward Christian iconography, which is available for talking about the Last Judgment, but he's evoking it in his own language. So here, for example, from 1912 is Deluge 1. Well, Deluge is a reference to the flood, the biblical flood, a flood which overtook the whole world. So it's again a sort of a notion of a devastating moment of transformation. Actually, that's about something that happened in the past, according to the Bible. But for Kandinsky, he's almost sort of linking it to the story of the apocalypse, the story of the book of Revelations, about a great turmoil in the future when the world comes to an end. There's a sort of linking between content and form in a way, because instead of showing a lot of people drowning, which is what usually happens when people try to represent the deluge in art, he's showing a sort of dissolution of form. At the level of form, you have a kind of dissolving of everything. Maybe that's a more effective way to represent it. And certainly Kandinsky, when he talks about making works on the theme of the deluge, he talked about first making the mistake of being too concrete about it, and then later trying to express the very idea of the deluge in a more direct way. So that certainly seems to be his aim. We've got some kind of mountainous landscape, various figures. This could be a flash of lightning. How do you represent lightning in art? It's not going to stand there waiting for you to carefully delineate its outlines or something like that. There's no correct way to do it. You've almost got to do some kind of stylized approach. And here we're talking about an artist who's lived through Art Nouveau and its stylizations of waves and so forth. All that will help him in developing his language. Someone's blowing on a trumpet, that's the sort of imagery that you have of the end of time. Here's that imagery of someone blowing a trumpet again down here. This is All Saints. Well, here actually the title also is cueing you in that this is a kind of religious imagery that he's trying to deal with a religious subject matter. Yeah, maybe another trumpet here. But we also seem to have an imagery of a boat. There's images of boats several times in his work. That fits with the Deluge theme. Well, maybe there's a boat here with oars. Maybe these are boats as well. The same symbols come back in different combinations. So maybe we're already in a kind of deluge imagery here. There's all sort of watery, splashy kind of forms. In this case, we have some help of trying to work out what things are. This is an oil painting on cardboard, but there's also an earlier version which is a painting behind glass. Very similar, but much more detailed. So we can see a sort of veiling of the subject matter from this one to this one. So we see, for instance, it's a horse. This idea of painting behind glass is an influence of Bavarian folk art. That was one kind of form that folk art took in the Munich region. Bavaria is the state of which Munich is the main city. And it's a visual language which is avoided the whole Renaissance tradition. It looks back to Byzantine, the flatness of it all, gold halos, which for a Russian artist is easy to accommodate to, because his own native religious art it doesn't go through the Renaissance, as we said. Painting the frame as well. It's coming back again and then going to one step further with it. This is also a work, I think, which has this theme of the Deluge. Painting with white border, 1913. This is pretty much something you could call abstract, I think. Now it's really impossible to pin down specific forms that represent something. It's really a matter of shapes and colours and the responses we get to them. But it's this sort of topsy-turvy universe of forms dissolving and blurring into each other. Maybe the imagery is still the imagery of the Deluge. The work takes its title from this white form here, which Kandinsky describes as being like a wave unfolding and then gradually coming to an end here. That was for him a sort of solution to the painting when he worked out about the white form, how to use that. So you can see how the language really becomes gradually abstract, and it's in the context of a kind of religious subject matter. There's another of these paintings behind glass, St. George, 1911. I'm jumping backwards and forwards in time, going back to a slightly earlier work in order to help you recognize some of the imagery. So St. George on horseback fighting the dragon. It's a theme that's particularly popular in Russian icon painting. And so it's not surprising that Kandinsky picks it up. That's evidence of his connection to his own native tradition, the great Russian icon painting tradition. St. George is a revered saint in Russia. and here's St. George's lance that he's killing the monster, the dragon, with. Maybe we still have something that's a bit like that lance here. You know, we have similar kind of formal elements, even though we don't have any. We can't talk about a figure on horseback or anything like that. But some of the visual elements seem related to earlier works. Improvisation 30. 1913. Well, 1913 is the year before the outbreak of the First World War. 1914 is the year that war started. But already in Europe at that time, you have all sorts of tensions. Many people were, aware that there was a danger of a conflict. And it's not surprising, well, we're seeing here what looked like cannons. And maybe they're firing. There's a landscape, buildings on hills or whatever. So a theme of conflict. Maybe it's a way of reading present day events and worries about what's going to happen in the world around you. To read it not in a kind of literal way, but as a kind of a symbol of, this is the sign of a transformation that's going to happen. Not uncommon for people to think about it that way at the time, to think that even warfare has its place as a kind of part of the grander scheme of things to transform how we, life, and it may be a difficult transition phase, but coming out at the end of it will be a better world. So we may not share any of Kandinsky's religious views, but we may, we could read them as saying, well, yeah, it's just a sort of escapist way of interpreting the actual real social events of the time. And the tensions that were around at that point in time. They kind of erupt into the First World War and Allied events such as the Russian Revolution in 1917. So this image of a topsy-turvy world is metaphoric of all that. Study for composition 2. In this case, it's not so much emphasizing turmoil as emphasizing a sort of harmony, to me a sort of paradise-like environment. Maybe this is what we'll see after the turmoil is over. Maybe a little bit of the influence of Gauguin, all his images from Tahiti, of harmonious, living in a utopian world with nature. People are just lying around on the grass or whatever, the trees bearing fruit or whatever. It seems less a scene of turmoil, but a more utopian or paradise image. Study for composition 7. And composition 7 was one of the largest works he produced. So often there are many studies made. In this case, he did 2 months of preliminary work for it, and more studies than for any other composition. 30 plus drawings, watercolor sketches that he produced. This is a very advanced kind of study for it. You could, if you want, say, well, this looks like the head of a figure blowing a trumpet. You could just about make out certain bits of imagery that, knowing his earlier art. You have the same kind of dialogue between line and colour, but each is free to set. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they don't, but they're free to do so. Sometimes this colour will be the same inside and outside. Translucency or transparency, dissolution of form is the result. Colour is the main means. Fluid, these sort of lines, which are a little bit like the lines from the vocabulary of Art Nouveau. And this is the kind of visual culture that he's drawing upon. Biblical illustrations of the figures with trumpets and so forth, cities, tumults of water or fire or whatever it should be. This is all in his visual imagination. Of course, even Dürer illustrates scene from Revelation, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. His style is very different. This is the kind of the post-Renaissance or the Renaissance treatment of such a theme, but here's an artistic tradition that just ignores all that, and which is what Kandinsky is tapping into. This is a sort of image of the end of time by a 19th century British artist, just to give you an idea. John Martin, The Great Day of His Wrath from 1852. Very, very large painting, lots of realistic detail, trying to imagine, God bringing life to the end, on earth. People will be facing judgment. So this is a kind of like a large screen, almost a quasi-cinematic kind of realistic approach to it. But this is exactly what Kandinsky is rejecting. He wants a different language to say a different thing. Can't say what he wants to say in the language of realism. Deluge, I choose this almost at random. Deluge, Virgin and Child, as a sort of example of 19th century religious art. French artist Deluge. Treating God as just a little baby with a pretty mum or something like that. To a certain way of thinking, this is a kind of trivialization of religious thinking in art. So how do you escape from that? You have to escape from the whole language of realism. Materialism has infected even the language of art. It might be the way you think about it. The Red Oval, 1920. I'm jumping ahead a few years, and there's something important that's happened between the previous paintings and this painting. This is the first painting by Kandinsky I'm showing you that is from after the date of the Russian Revolution, 1917. He's re-engaging with Russia. In the first few years after the revolution, things are very open in a way. You know, they're a modernist artist trying to see what place they would have in the new society. It's very different from the situation in China, where as soon as you have the revolution, a certain kind of style is imposed, a realist style. They'd already prepared for that with the Yan'an talks and everything in the liberated area. But in Russia, you know, the state didn't really decide what was its official style till quite a bit later. So in the early years, the modernists actually were probably the more enthusiastic ones of trying to create art for the new society. Disillusion sets in after a little while, but we see Kandinsky in dialogue with what's happening in his own home country. And there are other artists there who are also working in an abstract style. Perhaps the most important amongst them is Malevich. And Malevich was using a geometric abstract style. He had a different route to abstraction. He himself was also one of the pioneers of abstraction. It's important to remember abstract painting didn't have one beginning. There wasn't one father of the whole thing. There are many different people who find their own routes towards abstraction. So for Malevich, he uses this geometrical language, very different from Kandinsky. But what we're seeing in the painting, the red oval, is Kandinsky in dialogue with Malevich and the other sort of geometric abstract artists of his home country. You know, just as I'm suggesting, being Russian kind of helped Kandinsky escape from the Renaissance tradition because it actually was not his tradition after all anyway. So the same was true for other Russian artists. They were all able to kind of abandon that Western European tradition so much more easily. You know, some parts of Russia are further east than anywhere in China. You go to Vladivostok or something like that. It's very, very far east. It's as much an Asian country as a European country. It has shores. Touches Europe. You know, St. Petersburg is very close to Europe, and there are times when Russian culture was very open to Europe. Peter the Great was a great westernizer. Catherine the Great had everyone at the Russian court speaking French and everything, but that's only part of the story. So the geometric language of Malevich is merging with some remnants of this more organic language of Kandinsky. It's a slightly hybrid work in that sense. The title of the work comes from this red oval. Well, yeah, there's some other artists working in Russia called Ivan Kliun, who also produced a work in 1918, untitled work, exhibited in Moscow that year, which included an oval form. There may be some specific meanings. I mean, the idea of form sort of floating in space, that's very Malevich-like. With Malevich's paintings, you get the sense that these are just objects floating in some vast spatial arena. And you could even imagine moving around and seeing them from different angles. You start to get a feeling of the same thing in this work with Kandinsky, which you never did in his earlier work. But this red oval has been suggested by scholars who've looked into all the detail of this, that there may be some personal meanings and some specifically Russian associations all around the world people have Easter eggs, eggs are associated with new life and so forth. So Easter is that somehow it all gets tied up together. But in Russia, traditionally, apparently, red eggs were taken to cemeteries after Easter to honor the dead. Kandinsky had a son, Volodya, who died when he was just a little infant in June of 1920, the year this painting was made. Sometimes they would throw their eggs into streams at Easter to commemorate infants who had died before they were baptized. So there's some possible connection there. There's even maybe a kind of boat image here. Is this a boat with an oar? Could be. So he's an artist in dialogue with other artists here. And we'll see this geometric side of his art coming out more and more in the later works. Some of the artists in Russia, because they felt a certain kind of pressure in the new society to produce things which are useful, so they would use the language of their abstract art to decorate useful objects, and even Kandinsky does the same thing. So he's using his abstract language to decorate a teacup. In a sense, this is a sort of a trivialization of what he's been trying to do, but this is part of the pressures of what the new society had on artists. So eventually he moves and ends up finally in Paris. Black Accompaniment, 1924. So there's an example where his vocabulary has pretty much become a kind of geometric abstraction. This is sort of second phase of his abstraction. It's as if having found his way to abstract art, then he wants to build it up from the basic building bricks, lines and circles and squares, or what are the basic elements out of which you could build a painting. So let's try and investigate those different elements and then build a painting up from that. I want to have this sense of it as being a sort of collective project in some way, and maybe I haven't stressed that enough. I did talk about how he was working with Jarlensky and Gabriel Munter in Murnau, and I've just mentioned Malievich. But actually all the way through he was involved with different artist groups. He was the president of one or two of them, the Phalanx group. He was also in a group called the Blue Rider, the Blau Reiter. They had an exhibition together, him, Jarlensky, Paul Klee, Franz Marc. That was, they published together in 1912 a book, and they called the Almanac of the Blue Rider. So he's not really so much an isolated figure as maybe I should emphasize that. He's putting a lot of his ideas down on paper as well. In 1910 he'd already written this book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. I mean, that's really, his theory is in advance of his practice in that sense, that before he's made abstract art he's sort of talking about the abstract language of art. Like Seurat before him, he believed that individual lines could convey certain feelings. So when he produces these geometric abstract paintings, he's kind of exploring the different possibilities of evoking certain feelings by the different geometric elements. He felt, for instance, horizontal lines have a sensation of coldness to them. Vertical lines have a sensation of warmth. Then if you have diagonals, you can link link the two together. If you have an acute angle, it has a sensation of warmth. If you have a right angle, it has a sensation of coldness. Or he would say that where you put a line in relation to the border has a different emotional effect. And the closer a line gets to the border, the more you have a sense of tension. But then, for example, here, it's almost reaching the border, but not quite. But then if it did reach the border, then that tension would sort of discharge, and you wouldn't have that sense. Or he would say the size of an object and how far up or down the picture's plane it is that makes a difference. So, for example, he would say small forms appear looser, freer, less dense if they're in the upper part of the picture, and they feel more sort of heavier towards the more contained, towards the condensed, towards the bottom. Large forms will appear heavier if they're up in the upper half of the painting. It's as if he's trying to work out a kind of linguistic grammar of visual forms. And I think everything he says, there's a little bit of truth in this, but it's hard to really ultimately specify. For example, another thing he says is if there's a movement from left to right, you have a sense in the painting of going home. If there's a movement from the left, from right to left, then you have a sense of going out from home, of adventure. Maybe it's you're going against the direction of reading, so you have a sense of. Sometimes artists will use that. You have something like the flight into Egypt or something. You have that's an arduous journey, and you'll have people coming from right to left. That has a sense of it being more difficult. Composition 8. Well, here again, you have a sense of almost touching. The sense of tension, he would say. But if something actually touches, then it discharges. If you had literal subject matter, you wouldn't be able to pay attention to the interactions of forms and colours in this way. It's only because subject matter is gone that you're able to pay attention to the nuances of the effects of forms and colours. Something circle high up like this, he would say, would have this sort of heavy feeling. A circle to him has a sense of dynamic repose. There's movement, but it's sort of contained movement. Triangle, on the other hand, there's pressure or movement in a given direction. Those are the two forms which predominate in a lot of his works of this sort of period. Actually, I should have mentioned he goes to work at the Bauhaus Art School in Germany, joins the staff in 1922, so he's involved with a lot of artists and designers there, including Paul Klee. It's only after the failure of that project with the rise of the Nazis that he ends up moving to Paris. But for him in works like this is Composition 8, 1923, just after that move to the Bauhaus. Just forms and colours are enough. He says the impact of the acute angle of a triangle on a circle produces an effect no less powerful than the finger of God touching the finger of Adam in Michelangelo. So there's a pretty big claim. Each individual colour will have a different emotional quality to it. not just due to the associations that colour have, but somehow something intrinsic to the colours themselves. Colour is for him something alive. It's a spiritual force that directly affects the viewer. Here's a couple of statements where he talks in that way. He says, colour is a power which directly influences the soul. Colour produces a corresponding spiritual vibration, and it's only as a step towards this spiritual vibration that the elementary physical impression is of importance. Another kind of musical metaphors are quite important, so I'll give you another example. Colour is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, the soul is the piano with many strings, the artist is the hand which plays, touching one key or another to cause vibration in the soul. Sometimes he likens certain colours to certain sounds. There's a lot of interest in synesthesia at this time. What sounds and what sounds match what colours. Scriabin, the composer, invented a colour organ. So you press certain notes and certain colours will light up. For Kandinsky, green has a kind of restful association, lacking any undertone of grief, joy or passion. He calls it a bit self-satisfied though. He says it's the bourgeois of colours. Yellow, he says, is expansive, brash, shrill. Blue is a call for the infinite. Red glows in itself, warmth, material. Black, a silence without possibilities. White, a symbol of a world from which all colour as material attributes have disappeared. Acts on our psyche as a great absolute silence, like the pauses in music that temporarily break the melody. It's not a dead silence, but one pregnant with possibilities, which has the appeal of the nothingness that is before birth, of the world in the Ice Age. Well, here we're looking at a painting which is mostly white. Think of it as background, but background is as much an important part as anything else. Clearly here there's this strong upward motion, indicated. Translucency, one form overlaps another and a third colour comes in. Sometimes it's completely unconnected colours. You might feel that these works are less spontaneous or less emotional than his earlier works, but he didn't think of it that way. He wanted to have a kind of balancing between control and emotion. Somewhere I have a quotation for him. He described the earlier works, the Munich works, as full of explosions, patches violently impacting on one another, lines without hope, eruptions, rumblings, catastrophes. But then these more geometrical works, he says, he felt the need for a rather chilly calmness. He uses a metaphor from food. He says, like a gâteau chinoise, a Chinese cake, which I think is a little bit like what I would call a baked Alaska. I don't know if you know that kind of thing. Piping hot, yet ice hidden in their midst. It's a kind of a certain kind of dessert where it's cooked in the oven, but inside is ice cream. So it's got something hot, and then inside the hot is cold. It's a paradoxical thing. That's how he wants you to think of these, very geometric forms, but they've got the power of colour inside them. I wanted something topsy-turvy, a fiery stuffing poured into an icy cup. So it's almost like the reverse of the baked Alaska, where you have the inside is the hot thing, the outside appears cool, the geometry is cool, but the color is hot. It's hard to put these things into words. When you try to put it into words, then sure there are some. It's a translation problem, you know. It just because it's hard to translate a painting like this into words doesn't mean it doesn't have a meaning, any more than, you know, it would be hard to translate Tolstoy's War and Peace into a symphony, but that doesn't mean that Tolstoy's War and Peace doesn't have any meaning. You know, it's just a problem of translation. One of the sources that interested him a lot was the writing of the Theosophist or Madame Blavatsky. She is one of these sort of mystical thinkers of that time, believing in that, you know, you should explore Buddhism and also Asian thought, and recovering a kind of occult and mystical view of the world. And she, with someone called Ledbetter, wrote a book called Thought Forms. They believed that if you had sensitive vision, some people could notice the thoughts that people were thinking, sort of emanating around their body as a kind of aura, and that they could work out what emotions people were feeling from that. So in their book, there were illustrations showing the different emotions and what they looked like. So here are 3 of the illustrations from the book. By the way, these books, it's all now out of copyright and available as free ebooks and everything if you want to look into it. The one on the right is called Radiating Affection. So these are supposed to be actual things that you could see if you had sensitive enough vision. The top one on the left is angry jealousy, and the lower one on the left is sudden fright. So this is supposed to be the direct thought forms of certain emotions. Well, that kind of idea, it's so close to the idea that, well, you could express certain emotions through certain forms and colours in art. You know, it's almost as if there's a kind of natural truth to it all. Go through these a little bit quickly. Swinging, 1925. Silence, composition, 1928. Well, I think you were starting. Sometimes you can see, well, this is a seascape, isn't it? You know, these are ships. It's a landscape, clouds maybe. But he's concerned more with the mood. Sometimes he's working in watercolor. He explores the same ideas in different mediums. So what he's done here is using stencils, and then he's blowing with an atomizer, blowing color onto it, so spreading it, using breath to spread it. Again, you have this sort of translucency or overlap of forms, rising forms again. This is the work Into the Dark, 1928. Jocular Sounds, 1929. Slightly returning back to touches of figuratism, to the touches of the figurative. A little bit playful element coming in. Maybe that's his dialogue with the artist Paul Klee, who was his good friend, who often has this sort of childlike, playful quality in his works. And then, you know, a little bit later on, we're starting to see this return to more organic forms. This is, you know, Composition 9, 1936. sometimes it's almost like he's being inspired by the kind of forms you might see down a microscope. All this is kind of modern 20th century discoveries, the ability to take photos down a microscope and so forth, the books that were published showing tiny creatures that are newly discovered and all that, the beginnings of life. His imagery is often of very small scale, little unicellular creatures of life beginning, or it could be a very vast scale, forms that remind you of planets or something, eclipsing moon, the very, very vast or the very tiny, it's macrocosm, microcosm, but it's all about thinking of life in a larger sense. But there's this sense of things in a sort of fluid medium floating around, organic biomorphic shapes like the artist Miro also was interested in at that time. Little kind of like a fetus or something like that, some tiny little shrimp or whatever it is, or amoeba-like forms. Accompanied contrast. There's very strong textural effects in this work. Flesh, 1943, the arrow. Well, here is the arrow. Arrows appear in a lot of Paul Klee's work, and I think that, it's again evidence of their friendship. Once more, it looks like things you might see down a microscope or something like that. Some more geometric forms. Oh, isn't this even the stylized representation of that boat form that we saw in the earlier work? Some images have survived all this time. Yeah, again, it could be some kind of jellyfish or something, or again, amoebic forms. Temper de Land, 1944. Something a little bit playful coming in. There's a new kind of mood. Strange creature-like forms standing hieratically like this, circle and square, 1943. So you could say there's a sort of coming back at the end from a pure abstraction, a language just of geometric shapes, to some kind of symbolic association with the world. And again, I think I could compare this to works where we're outside the Renaissance tradition. The flat world of a Byzantine mosaic. Okay, good. So we're just slightly rushing there towards the end, but I think we reached the end of what I want to say about Kandinsky. So next week we'll be looking at Mondrian, who takes a completely different route into abstraction.